The late afternoon sun beat down on the quiet suburban streets as 17-year-old Damon carefully drove his mother's silver sedan through the neighborhood. He had just finished grocery shopping at the local supermarket, picking up ingredients for his mom's famous chicken dinner. The back seat was filled with brown paper bags containing fresh vegetables, spices, and all the fixings for what would become their family's Sunday meal. Damon had been driving for almost 2 years now, and his mother had drilled safety into his head from day one. "Always use your turn signals," she would say. "Keep both hands on the wheel. Never speed, and always be respectful if you get pulled over." These weren't just typical parent warnings. They carried extra weight coming from a woman who understood the world better than most. The neighborhood he was driving through was nothing like his own. Here the houses sat on large lots with perfectly manicured lawns. 3-car garages were common, and luxury vehicles lined the driveways. Damon didn't feel out of place exactly, but he was aware that he stood out. His mother had taught him that awareness wasn't paranoia, it was survival. As he approached a 4-way stop, Damon came to a complete halt, looking both ways before proceeding. He had learned to be extra careful in areas like this. His phone buzzed with a text from his mom asking if he had remembered to get the special seasoning she needed. He smiled, knowing he had grabbed 2 bottles just to be safe. That's when he noticed the police cruiser in his rearview mirror. Officer Derek Thompson had been patrolling this beat for over 15 years. He knew every street, every corner, and most importantly, he knew who belonged and who didn't. When he spotted the sedan with the young black driver, something in his gut told him to pay attention. It wasn't anything the kid was doing wrong. His driving was actually pretty good. But Thompson had learned to trust his instincts over the years. Thompson had a reputation at the station. Some of the younger officers looked up to him as a veteran who knew the streets. Others whispered about complaints that had been filed against him over the years. None of them had ever stuck, though. Thompson knew how to handle himself, knew how to write reports that told the right story. He watched the sedan for several blocks, waiting for any reason to make a stop. The driver used his turn signals properly, stayed within the speed limit, and came to complete stops at every sign. But Thompson wasn't discouraged. In his experience, it was often the careful ones who had something to hide. When the sedan slowed down slightly as it passed a school zone, even though it was Sunday and no children were present, Thompson saw his opportunity. He could claim the driver had been speeding before the school zone. It wasn't true. But who would question a 15-year veteran's word against some kids? Thompson hit his lights and sirens. Damon's heart sank when he saw the flashing red and blue lights behind him. He immediately began going through his mental checklist, the one his mother had made him memorize. Pull over safely. Turn off the engine. Keep your hands visible on the steering wheel. Be polite and respectful. Never argue. Never make sudden movements. He found a safe spot to pull over on a wide residential street, making sure he was far enough from traffic but still visible to any passers-by. As he put the car in park and turned off the engine, Damon took a deep breath. He hadn't done anything wrong, so this should be quick and simple. But as Officer Thompson approached the driver's side window, Damon could sense something was off. The officer's hand rested on his service weapon and his jaw was set in a hard line. This didn't feel routine. "License and registration," Thompson barked without any greeting or explanation for the stop. "Yes, sir," Damon replied respectfully. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Just get your documents." Damon moved slowly and deliberately, announcing each movement as his mother had taught him. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket now." He pulled out his license. "The registration is in the glove compartment." "I'm going to reach for it now." As Damon opened the glove compartment, Thompson tensed. The young man pulled out the registration and insurance card, handing both documents through the window along with his license. Thompson examined the documents, noting the address was from across town, a much different neighborhood than where they currently stood. The car was registered to Patricia Johnson. "This your car?" "No, sir, it belongs to my mother. I was grocery shopping for her." "Uh-huh." Thompson's tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. "Step out of the vehicle." Damon's pulse quickened, but he complied. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "No matter what happens, stay calm. Be polite. Do what they ask. We'll sort out the details later." "Is there a problem, officer?" Damon asked as he stood next to his car, hands visible at his sides. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." Now Damon was really confused. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't broken any laws. But his mother's training kicked in again and he complied without argument. The cool metal of the car felt strange against his palms as he leaned forward slightly. Assuming the position he'd seen in movies but never expected to find himself in, Thompson's partner, Officer Rodriguez, had arrived on the scene and was watching the interaction with growing concern. Rodriguez was younger, newer to the force, and he couldn't understand why this stop had escalated so quickly. The kid seemed polite and cooperative. His driving had looked fine when Rodriguez had observed him from the second patrol car. "What's the reason for the stop?" Rodriguez asked Thompson quietly. "Speeding," Thompson replied without taking his eyes off Damon. Rodriguez frowned. He had been behind Thompson when they started following the sedan, and he hadn't seen any speeding. But Thompson was his senior partner, and Rodriguez had learned not to question him too openly. Thompson began searching Damon, patting him down roughly. "You got anything on you I should know about? Any weapons, drugs?" "No, sir," Damon answered truthfully. "I don't use drugs and I don't carry weapons." "We'll see about that." Thompson's hands moved to search Damon's pockets, pulling out his cell phone, wallet, and a stick of gum. Nothing suspicious at all. The search of Damon's person turned up nothing, but Thompson wasn't ready to give up. "I'm going to search the vehicle now." "You got any problem with that?" Damon wanted to say yes, he did have a problem with it. He knew his rights. His mother had made sure of that. But he also knew that asserting those rights in this moment might make things worse. "I don't consent to a search, but I won't resist if you choose to search anyway." It was a careful response his mother had taught him, clearly stating his position while avoiding escalation. Thompson's face reddened slightly. He didn't like smart-mouthed kids who knew legal language. In his experience, kids who talked like that were usually up to something. "Stay right there and don't move," Thompson ordered, as he began going through the car. Damon stood perfectly still, watching as the officer searched through his mother's vehicle. Thompson pulled out the grocery bags, looking through the vegetables and seasonings as if they might be hiding contraband. He checked under the seats in the console, and even in the spare tire compartment. The search turned up nothing but groceries and normal car items, registration papers, a phone charger, and a small first aid kit. But Thompson wasn't satisfied. In his mind, the kid was guilty of something. Maybe not drugs or weapons, but something. He had been patrolling these streets long enough to know when someone didn't belong, and this kid definitely didn't belong here. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Thompson continued his search of the vehicle. Damon remained motionless against the car, his hands still pressed against the cool metal surface. Every few seconds, he could hear Thompson muttering under his breath, clearly frustrated that his search wasn't turning up anything incriminating. Officer Rodriguez watched from a few feet away, his discomfort growing by the minute. He had been partnered with Thompson for 6 months now, and while he respected the veteran officer's experience, something about this stop felt wrong from the beginning. The kid had been driving perfectly fine, was being completely cooperative, and seemed genuinely confused about why he had been pulled over in the first place. "Find anything?" Rodriguez asked, already knowing the answer. "Still looking," Thompson replied curtly, now examining the contents of the glove compartment for the second time. He pulled out the car's manual, registration papers, and a small packet of napkins from a fast food restaurant. Nothing suspicious. Nothing illegal. Nothing that would justify the way this stop was proceeding. But Thompson wasn't ready to admit defeat. In his 15 years on the force, he had developed what he called a sixth sense about people. And everything about this situation screamed trouble to him. Young black kid in an expensive neighborhood driving a car that wasn't his, acting just a little too polite and cooperative. In Thompson's experience, innocent people didn't know their rights as well as this kid seemed to. "Where did you say you were coming from?" Thompson asked, emerging from the passenger side of the vehicle. "The grocery store on 5th Avenue, Damon answered for the second time. "I was shopping for my mother." "And where exactly does your mother live?" Damon provided his home address, which Thompson wrote down in his notepad. The address confirmed what Thompson already suspected. The kid was from the other side of town, a predominantly black neighborhood that Thompson rarely patrolled. "Long way to come for groceries," Thompson observed. "They don't have stores in your neighborhood." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Damon felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he kept his voice level and respectful. My mom likes the selection at that particular store. She's very specific about her ingredients, Thompson snorted. I bet she is. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. The comment had an edge to it that made him cringe. He had grown up in a mixed neighborhood and had friends from all backgrounds. The way Thompson was talking reminded him of conversations he'd heard from his grandfather's generation, the kind of comments that made family dinners awkward. Thompson, Rodriguez said quietly, maybe you should let me handle this. Thompson cut him off sharply. He turned back to Damon. You know what I think? I think you're dealing drugs. I think you come to this neighborhood to sell to rich kids, and today just happened to be your unlucky day. Damon's eyes widened in shock. Sir, I'm not a drug dealer. I'm a high school student. I work part-time at a community center teaching kids basketball. You can call them and verify that. Oh, I bet you teach kids all right, Thompson said with a sneer, probably teaching them all sorts of things. The implication in Thompson's voice was clear, and it made Damon's stomach turn. He thought about his job at the community center, how much he loved working with the younger kids, helping them with their homework and teaching them basic basketball skills. Some of those kids came from rough situations, and the center was often the safest place in their day. The idea that this officer was twisting something so positive into something sinister made him feel sick. Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Damon said carefully. I haven't done anything wrong. I was driving the speed limit. I have all my proper documentation, and I've been completely cooperative with your requests. Thompson stepped closer to Damon, invading his personal space in a way that felt threatening. You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can come into this neighborhood and nobody will notice? I wasn't trying to hide anything, Damon replied, his voice starting to show strain. I was just grocery shopping. For your mama, Thompson said mockingly. How old are you, boy? 17, 18, and you're still running errands for mama? The word boy hit Damon like a slap. He had heard that tone before, knew the weight that word carried when said in that particular way. His hands trembled slightly against the car, and he had to take a deep breath to maintain his composure. Rodriguez couldn't stay quiet anymore. Thompson, the kid's documents check out. He's been cooperative. Maybe we should just give him a warning and... Are you questioning my judgment, Rodriguez? Thompson whirled around to face his partner, his face flushed with anger. Because if you think you know better than me how to handle this situation, maybe you'd like to explain that to the sergeant. Rodriguez backed down, but his expression remained troubled. He had seen Thompson get aggressive before, but never quite like this. There was something personal about the way Thompson was treating this kid, something that went beyond normal police procedure. Thompson turned back to Damon, his anger now fully focused on the teenager. I smell marijuana in this vehicle. Damon's head snapped up. What? No, there's no marijuana. I don't smoke marijuana. Are you calling me a liar? No, sir, I would never, because I've been doing this job for 15 years and I know what marijuana smells like. And I'm telling you, I smell it coming from this car. Rodriguez frowned and took a step closer to the vehicle, trying to detect any odor that might justify Thompson's claim. All he could smell were the groceries in the back seat, fresh vegetables, seasonings, and maybe a hint of the air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. No marijuana, no drugs of any kind. But Rodriguez knew that if he contradicted Thompson's claim, it would create a serious problem. Police officers were supposed to back each other up even when they had doubts. The thin blue line, they called it. But watching Thompson fabricate evidence made Rodriguez's stomach turn. I'm going to need to search you again, Thompson announced. More thoroughly this time. Damon's heart was racing now. He could sense the situation spiraling completely out of control, but he didn't know how to stop it. Every response he gave seemed to make Thompson angrier. Every attempt at cooperation was met with more suspicion and hostility. Sir, you already searched me. You didn't find anything because there's nothing to find? Well, maybe I missed something the first time. Turn around. As Damon complied, turning to face the car again, he noticed a few residents had come out of their houses to see what was happening. An elderly white woman stood on her porch across the street watching the scene unfold. A man walking his dog had stopped on the sidewalk about 20 feet away, clearly observing the interaction. For a brief moment, Damon felt a flicker of hope. Witnesses. If something went wrong, at least there would be people who saw what really happened. But that hope quickly faded as he realized that in a neighborhood like this, the witnesses would probably side with the police officer over a black teenager. No matter what they saw, Thompson's second search was even more aggressive than the first. His hands moved roughly over Damon's body, checking pockets that had already been checked, patting down areas that clearly couldn't conceal anything. It felt less like a search and more like harassment, designed to humiliate and intimidate. "Please," Damon said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to go home." "Oh, you want to go home?" Thompson's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to come to this neighborhood looking for trouble." "I wasn't looking for trouble. I was buying groceries." Thompson grabbed Damon's arm and spun him around so they were face to face. "Don't you dare lie to me again. I know exactly what you were doing here, and it wasn't shopping for your mama." The grip on Damon's arm was tight enough to leave bruises, and the 17-year-old winced in pain. He could see something dangerous flickering in Thompson's eyes, a kind of rage that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. "Officer Thompson," Rodriguez said, his voice shaky but determined, I think you need to mind your own business and let me do my job," Thompson snapped without taking his eyes off Damon. Damon tried to pull his arm free, not aggressively, just trying to relieve the pressure from Thompson's grip, but the movement seemed to trigger something in the officer. "Resisting arrest," Thompson shouted suddenly. "He's resisting." "What?" "No, I'm not." Damon started to protest, but his words were cut short as Thompson shoved him hard against the car. The shove sent Damon stumbling into the side of his mother's car, his shoulder connecting hard with the vehicle's frame. The impact sent a sharp pain shooting down his arm, but before he could even process what had happened, Thompson was on him again. "Stop resisting," Thompson yelled, even though Damon wasn't resisting anything. The teenager had his hands up, trying to show he wasn't a threat, trying to de-escalate a situation that seemed to be spiraling completely beyond his control. "I'm not resisting," Damon called out, his voice cracking with fear and confusion. "Please, I'm not doing anything." But Thompson seemed to be operating on a completely different reality. In his mind, every movement Damon made was aggressive. Every word the teenager spoke was defiant. The veteran officer had convinced himself that this young man was dangerous, and now he was acting on that conviction. Rodriguez stood frozen for a moment, watching in horror as his partner's behavior crossed every line of professional conduct he had learned at the police academy. This wasn't proper procedure. This wasn't how you handled a cooperative suspect. This was something else entirely. "Thompson, stop," Rodriguez called out. "He's complying." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Thompson had moved behind Damon now, grabbing the teenager's wrists and twisting them behind his back with unnecessary force. Damon cried out in pain as his shoulders were wrenched at an unnatural angle. "You're hurting me," Damon gasped, trying to breathe through the pain shooting through his shoulders and arms. "Should have thought about that before you decided to resist," Thompson growled, applying even more pressure to Damon's arms. The elderly woman across the street had come down from her porch and was now standing at the edge of her property, her phone in her hand. She wasn't filming yet, but she was clearly considering it. The man with the dog had also moved closer, no longer pretending to just happen to be walking by. Rodriguez noticed the gathering witnesses and felt his anxiety spike even higher. If this situation was recorded and went viral, it would be a disaster for everyone involved. He had to find a way to calm Thompson down before things got even worse. "Partner, we've got eyes on us," Rodriguez said in a low voice, hoping to remind Thompson that they were being watched. Thompson glanced around and saw the witnesses, but instead of moderating his behavior, he seemed to become even more aggressive. It was as if he felt he had to justify his actions by proving that Damon was indeed dangerous. "Everyone step back," Thompson shouted to the gathered residents. "This is official police business." Damon could feel the situation spinning completely out of control. His mother's voice echoed in his head. All the conversations they'd had about staying safe during police encounters. She had prepared him for many scenarios, but she had never imagined something like this. A situation where complete compliance still wasn't enough to keep her son safe. Remembering his mother's advice about having witnesses and documentation, Damon managed to speak through his pain. "Officer, I'd like to call my mother. Can I please call my mother?" The request was reasonable and legal. In many jurisdictions, minors had the right to contact their parents during police encounters. but Thompson interpreted it as another sign of defiance. "Your mama can't help you now," Thompson snarled. "You should have called her before you decided to come here and cause trouble." "I wasn't causing trouble," Damon repeated desperately. "I was just buying groceries. Shut up." Thompson yanked Damon's arms higher behind his back, causing the teenager to cry out again. That's when Damon made a decision that would change everything. Despite the pain, despite the fear, he managed to work his phone partially out of his pocket with one hand. He needed to call his mother. Not just because he was scared, though he was terrified, but because he knew she needed to know what was happening. "He's going for something," Thompson suddenly screamed. "He's got a weapon." "No," Damon shouted back. "It's just my phone. I'm trying to call my mother." Rodriguez could clearly see that it was indeed just a phone in Damon's hand. There was no weapon, no threat, nothing that justified Thompson's escalating panic. But before Rodriguez could intervene, Thompson had made his decision. With a sudden, violent motion, Thompson swept Damon's legs out from under him and drove him face first into the hot asphalt. The impact was devastating. Damon's cheek scraped against the rough pavement and his phone skittered away across the street. "Stop!" Damon cried out as Thompson pressed his knee into the teenager's back, using his full body weight to pin him down. "You're crushing me. I can't breathe." The scene was horrifying to witness. A 17-year-old boy, guilty of nothing more than grocery shopping in the wrong neighborhood, was being brutalized by a police officer who had completely lost control of himself and the situation. The elderly woman across the street finally started recording with her phone. The man with the dog was already filming. Both of them were talking, their voices carrying across the quiet residential street. "This is wrong," the woman was saying to her phone's camera. "This boy hasn't done anything. He's been polite and cooperative this whole time." The man with the dog was providing his own commentary. "The officer is using excessive force. The suspect appears to be complying and is not resisting arrest." Rodriguez knew that these recordings would be crucial evidence, but right now his focus was on stopping his partner before someone got seriously hurt, or worse. "Thompson," Rodriguez called out more forcefully. "That's enough." "He's not resisting." But Thompson seemed to be in his own world now, pressing his knee harder into Damon's back while the teenager gasped for air beneath him. Damon's face was pressed against the hot asphalt, scraping his cheek raw. His arms were still twisted behind his back at a painful angle, and Thompson's weight was making it difficult to breathe. "Please," Damon wheezed, his voice barely audible. "I can't breathe. Please." The words sent a chill through Rodriguez and the witnesses. They had all heard those words before, in other videos, in other situations that had ended tragically. Rodriguez knew he had to act. "Thompson, get off him." Rodriguez stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio to call for backup, not to help with the arrest but to help control his own partner. Thompson looked up at Rodriguez with wild eyes. "Don't you dare interfere with my arrest." "This isn't an arrest, it's assault." Rodriguez shot back, surprising himself with his boldness. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Thompson stared at his partner for a long moment, his knee still pressed into Damon's back, before slowly looking around at the witnesses recording everything. For the first time since the traffic stop began, Thompson seemed to realize that his actions might have consequences. The witnesses were recording. His partner was questioning him. And beneath him, a 17-year-old boy was struggling to breathe. But instead of backing down, Thompson doubled down on his position. In his mind, admitting he was wrong now would be admitting that he had just assaulted an innocent teenager for no reason. That was unthinkable. So he had to be right. Damon had to be dangerous. This had to be justified. "He was reaching for a weapon," Thompson announced loudly, clearly speaking for the benefit of the recording witnesses. "I observed the suspect reaching into his pocket in a threatening manner." "It was a phone," Rodriguez protested. "Everyone here saw it was just a phone." Thompson ignored his partner and continued his narrative. The suspect was acting nervous and suspicious throughout the traffic stop. He exhibited signs of being under the influence of illegal substances. Damon tried to lift his head to protest, but Thompson's weight kept him pinned to the asphalt. The rough pavement had scraped his cheek bloody, and every breath was a struggle with the officer's knee pressed into his back. "My phone," Damon managed to gasp. "I need to call my mother." The phone had landed about 10 feet away when it skittered across the pavement. It was face down but still intact, And unknown to everyone at the scene, when Damon had partially activated it while trying to call his mother, it had automatically dialed her number. The call had connected just as Thompson had screamed about a weapon. On the other end of that call, Brigadier General Patricia Johnson was listening to every word of her son's assault, her maternal instincts and military training both screaming at her to take action. She was already in her car, already racing toward the GPS location her phone was showing her, already calling in favors from contacts throughout the city to find out exactly what was happening to her child. But none of the people at the scene knew help was coming. All they knew was that a routine traffic stop had become a nightmare, and it was all being recorded for the world to see. General Patricia Johnson had been in a Pentagon briefing about overseas supply chains when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Under normal circumstances, she would never answer a personal call during such an important meeting, but something about the timing felt wrong. Her son was supposed to be grocery shopping, a simple errand that should have taken an hour at most. She glanced at her phone and saw Damon's name on the caller ID. But when she answered, instead of her son's voice, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "Stop resisting," came a man's aggressive shout through the phone. "I'm not resisting." That was definitely Damon's voice, high with fear and confusion. General Johnson immediately excused herself from the meeting, stepping into the hallway as she listened in horror to what was clearly her son being brutalized by someone in authority. Her military training kicked in instantly. Assess the situation, gather intelligence, formulate a response plan. "Please, I'm not doing anything." She heard Damon cry out, followed by what sounded like a physical altercation. "Thompson, stop!" came another voice, younger, less aggressive. "He's complying." General Johnson was already moving toward the parking garage, her heels clicking rapidly against the Pentagon's polished floors. As she walked, she was simultaneously listening to the ongoing assault of her son and using her other phone to make calls. First call, her aide-de-camp to reschedule all her afternoon meetings. Second call, her contact at the local police department to get real-time information about any traffic stops involving her son. Third call, her personal attorney, who she had on speed dial for exactly situations like this. By the time she reached her car, she had confirmed the location of the incident through GPS tracking on Damon's phone. She was 20 minutes away, but she was going to make it in 15. General Johnson had commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. She had made split-second decisions that affected thousands of lives. She had stared down foreign generals and negotiated with hostile forces. But none of that compared to the fury and fear she felt hearing her 17-year-old son being brutalized by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. "You're hurting me," came Damon's voice through the phone, and General Johnson pressed the accelerator harder. She had spent Damon's entire life preparing him for encounters with law enforcement. They had practiced scenarios, rehearsed responses, role-played different situations. She had thought, hoped, that her son's polite demeanor and careful compliance would keep him safe. The realization that even perfect behavior wasn't enough to protect her child filled her with a rage that was both maternal and military, as she navigated through DC traffic with precision that would have impressed her combat drivers. General Johnson continued listening to the escalating situation. She heard Thompson's increasingly aggressive demands, heard her son's increasingly desperate pleas, and felt her heart break with every passing second. "He's going for something," came Thompson's panicked shout through the phone. "He's got a weapon." General Johnson knew immediately that the weapon was the phone she was listening through. Her son was trying to call her for help, just as she had taught him to do, and this officer was treating it as a threat. "No, it's just my phone. I'm trying to call my mother." Damon's voice was desperate now, terrified in a way that no 17-year-old should ever have to be. That's when General Johnson heard the sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life, the sickening impact of her son being driven face first into the asphalt, followed by his cries of pain as Thompson pinned him down with his knee. "Stop, you're crushing me. I can't breathe." The words hit General Johnson like physical blows. She had heard similar words in other contexts, knew how situations like this could end. Her son was in mortal danger and she was still 10 minutes away. General Johnson began making more calls as she drove, using every contact and every favor owed to her to ensure that backup was coming to that scene, backup that would prioritize her son's safety over whatever story the officer might try to tell. She called the local police chief, a man she had worked with on community policing initiatives. She called the mayor, who had appointed her to several civic committees. She called a federal judge who was a family friend. She called the local FBI field office. She called everyone she could think of who might be able to influence what was happening to her son. By the time she was 5 minutes away from the scene, General Johnson had mobilized a network of support that stretched from local government to federal law enforcement. But more importantly, she had contained her maternal panic and activated her military mindset. She was no longer just a terrified mother racing to save her child. She was a general preparing for battle. General Johnson knew that when she arrived at that scene, every word she spoke and every action she took would be recorded and scrutinized. She knew that as a black woman in America, even her military rank wouldn't necessarily protect her from becoming another victim of police violence. But she also knew that her son needed her to be more than just his mother right now. He needed her to be the commander she had trained her entire adult life to become. As she turned onto the residential street where the incident was taking place, General Johnson could see the crowd that had gathered. She could see the police cars with their flashing lights. She could see her son on the ground with an officer kneeling on his back. And she felt a calm settle over her that was more dangerous than any rage. General Johnson parked her black Cadillac directly behind the police cars, positioning it so that her license plates, which identified her as a federal government official, would be visible to everyone at the scene. She turned off her engine, checked her appearance in the rearview mirror to ensure her military bearing was intact, and stepped out of the vehicle. She was still wearing her Army dress uniform from the Pentagon meeting, the ribbons and decorations on her chest telling the story of a distinguished military career. The eagles on her shoulders identified her rank to anyone with military knowledge. But more than her uniform or her rank, it was the way she carried herself that commanded immediate attention. General Johnson walked toward the scene with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being in charge. Her shoulders were straight, her head held high, her expression controlled but unmistakably authoritative. Every step conveyed confidence, competence, and a quiet power that made people instinctively step back and take notice. The witnesses who had been recording the assault now turned their cameras toward this new arrival, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Officer Rodriguez saw her first, his eyes widening as he took in her military uniform and bearing. Officer Thompson was so focused on maintaining his position over Damon that he didn't notice the new arrival until she spoke. "Officer," General Johnson's voice carried the authority of someone used to commanding attention in rooms full of powerful people. It was neither loud nor aggressive, but it cut through all other sound like a sword through silk. "Step away from that young man immediately." Thompson looked up, his eyes taking in the military uniform, the rank insignia, the unmistakable aura of authority that surrounded this woman. For the first time since the traffic stop began, he found himself uncertain about how to respond. "Ma'am, this is official police business," Thompson said, but his voice lacked the aggressive confidence he had been displaying moments before. "That young man is my son," General Johnson replied, her words carrying the weight of both maternal love and military command. "And I am ordering you to step away from him, now." The word ordering was carefully chosen. General Johnson knew she had no legal authority to give orders to civilian police officers. But she also knew the psychological impact of hearing that word spoken with absolute conviction by someone clearly accustomed to being obeyed. Thompson found himself responding to that authority almost involuntarily, his knee lifting slightly off Damon's back as he processed this new dynamic. "Your son was resisting arrest," Thompson said, but the words came out sounding more like a question than a statement. "I have been listening to this entire encounter through an open phone line," General Johnson replied smoothly. "I heard no resistance. I heard a polite, cooperative young man being brutalized for the crime of grocery shopping." She gestured toward Damon's phone, still lying face down on the asphalt several feet away. "That phone has been connected to my number for the past several minutes. Every word of this encounter has been recorded, not just by these witnesses with their cameras, but by federal recording equipment that monitors all calls to Pentagon personnel." It was a slight exaggeration. Not all calls to Pentagon personnel were automatically recorded. But Thompson didn't know that. What he did know was that he had just been told that his entire interaction with this young man had been monitored and recorded by federal authorities. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, recognizing that General Johnson represented a lifeline out of the disaster this situation had become. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said respectfully, "I want you to know that I disagreed with my partner's handling of this situation. Your son has been completely cooperative throughout this encounter." General Johnson nodded to Rodriguez, acknowledging his statement while keeping her primary focus on Thompson and her son. The 5-second countdown that General Johnson had given Officer Thompson felt like an eternity to everyone present. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Thompson's knee remained pressed against Damon's back, but his confidence was visibly cracking under the weight of this woman's presence and authority. Thompson had dealt with angry parents before. He had faced down hostile crowds, aggressive suspects, and even hostile supervisors. But this was different. This woman wasn't yelling or threatening or pleading. She was simply stating facts with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what cards she held and wasn't afraid to play them. "1," General Johnson said quietly, beginning her countdown. Thompson's eyes darted around the scene, taking in the witnesses with their recording phones. His partner Rodriguez, who was clearly no longer supporting his actions, and this military officer who seemed to radiate authority from every pore. 2. Officer Rodriguez made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Thompson's shoulder. "Partner," Rodriguez said quietly, "you need to step back now." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Thompson hissed, but his voice lacked conviction. For the first time, he seemed to be realizing that he might have made a catastrophic mistake. 3. General Johnson's voice remained perfectly level, but everyone present could sense the steel underneath. She wasn't making idle threats. She was stating what would happen next if her son wasn't released immediately. Thompson looked down at Damon, then back at General Johnson. The teenager beneath him was clearly no threat. He was a kid who had been grocery shopping, who had been polite and cooperative throughout the entire encounter. But admitting that now would mean acknowledging that everything Thompson had done for the past 20 minutes was not just wrong, but criminal. 4. That's when Thompson noticed something that made his blood run cold. General Johnson wasn't just wearing any military uniform. She was wearing the dress uniform of a brigadier general. The eagles on her shoulders weren't just decorative. They represented someone with command authority over thousands of troops, someone with direct access to Pentagon leadership, someone who could make phone calls that would end careers. 5. General Johnson reached for her phone, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Colonel Martinez, this is General Johnson," she said into the device, her voice carrying clearly across the scene. "I need you to contact the FBI field office immediately. We have a federal civil rights violation in progress." The call was real. Colonel Martinez was her chief of staff, and he was indeed already coordinating with federal authorities based on the calls General Johnson had made during her drive to the scene. Thompson's resolve finally cracked. The combination of federal involvement, recorded evidence, and the growing realization that he had just assaulted the son of a general officer was too much for him to ignore. He slowly lifted his knee from Damon's back. "That's better," General Johnson said, ending her phone call but keeping the device in her hand. "Damon, move away from the officer slowly. Come to me." Damon pushed himself up from the asphalt, his face scraped and bleeding from being pressed against the rough surface. He moved carefully, still not quite believing that the nightmare was over. When he reached his mother's side, she placed a protective hand on his shoulder while keeping her eyes fixed on Thompson. "Are you injured?" she asked her son without looking away from the officer. "My face is scraped up, and my shoulders hurt from how he twisted my arms," Damon replied, his voice shaky with relief and residual fear. "Officer Rodriguez," General Johnson addressed the younger policeman, "I want you to take photographs of my son's injuries with your body camera. Document everything." Rodriguez nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am. I'll make sure everything is properly documented." Thompson stood there looking lost, as if he couldn't quite process how completely the situation had shifted. 20 minutes ago, he had been in complete control, convinced that he was dealing with just another suspicious teenager. Now he was facing a general officer who clearly had the connections and authority to destroy his career. "Officer Thompson," General Johnson said, her voice now carrying the tone she used when addressing subordinate officers who had failed in their duties. I want you to explain to me exactly what probable cause you had for this traffic stop. Thompson opened his mouth, then closed it again. The original excuse, speeding, was obviously false, and everyone present knew it. The search of the vehicle had turned up nothing. The claims about marijuana smell and weapons had been clearly debunked by the witnesses and recordings. The suspect was acting suspicious, Thompson finally said, but the words sounded weak even to him. Suspicious how? General Johnson pressed. Be specific. He was driving through this neighborhood and he doesn't live here. The words hung in the air and everyone present understood exactly what Thompson had just admitted. He had targeted Damon not because of any crime or traffic violation, but simply because he was a black teenager in a predominantly white neighborhood. So you initiated a traffic stop because my son was shopping while black? General Johnson's question was delivered with surgical precision. Is that your testimony, Officer Thompson? Thompson realized he had just confessed to racial profiling in front of multiple witnesses and recording devices. He tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. No, that's not... there were other factors. What other factors? General Johnson continued her cross-examination with the skill of someone who had interrogated enemy officers. You searched my son and found nothing. You searched his vehicle and found nothing but groceries. You claimed to smell marijuana that clearly wasn't there. You claimed he had a weapon that turned out to be his cell phone. So please enlighten me about these other factors that justified nearly suffocating a 17-year-old boy. By now, additional police units had begun arriving on the scene, not because Thompson had called for backup, but because General Johnson's contacts had ensured that supervisors would respond to investigate the situation. The first to arrive was Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran who took one look at the scene and knew immediately that he was dealing with a potential department-ending scandal. General Johnson, Sergeant Williams approached respectfully, having recognized her from community policing events she had attended. I'm Sergeant Williams. I understand there's been an incident. Yes, Sergeant Williams, General Johnson replied with professional courtesy. Officer Thompson just assaulted my son during what appears to have been an unlawful traffic stop based on racial profiling. Williams looked at Thompson, whose uniform was disheveled and whose face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. Then he looked at Damon, whose scraped face and shaken demeanor told their own story. Has anyone called for medical attention for the young man? Williams asked. I'll handle my son's medical care, General Johnson replied. But I want a complete investigation into this incident. I want Officer Thompson's body camera footage reviewed. I want all witness statements taken. And I want federal authorities contacted about potential civil rights violations. Williams nodded, knowing that this was exactly the kind of situation that could destroy careers and result in massive lawsuits against the department. Thompson, Williams said to the officer, I need you to step away from this scene. Rodriguez, you're with me to take statements. But Thompson wasn't ready to go quietly. In his mind, he had been doing his job correctly, and the presence of this general officer was just an unfortunate complication. He couldn't accept that he had been wrong from the beginning. Sergeant, this suspect was resisting arrest and reaching for what I believe to be a weapon, Thompson said, trying to reassert his version of events. Officer Thompson, General Johnson interrupted, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank. I have listened to the entire encounter through an open phone line. Every word of your interaction with my son has been recorded. There was no resistance. There was no weapon. There was no justification for the violence you inflicted on a child. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. What there was, Officer Thompson, was a 17-year-old boy shopping for groceries who was brutalized because you couldn't accept that a black teenager belonged in this neighborhood. That's not law enforcement. That's terrorism. The word terrorism hit like a thunderbolt. Everyone present understood that General Johnson had just accused a police officer of domestic terrorism. And given her position and authority, that accusation carried serious weight. Thompson's face went white, then red, as the full implications of the situation finally hit him. This wasn't just going to be a complaint in his file, or a few days of administrative leave. This was potentially career-ending, potentially criminal, potentially life-changing in the worst possible way. But instead of taking responsibility for his actions, Thompson doubled down one final time. I don't care who you are, he said to General Johnson, his voice rising. I was doing my job, And I won't be intimidated by some military officer who thinks she can come in here and tell me how to police my beat. The moment the words left his mouth, Thompson knew he had made a fatal error. Challenging the authority of a general officer, especially in front of witnesses and cameras, was not just unprofessional. It was the... General Johnson's smile disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by an expression that every soldier who had ever served under her command would recognize immediately. It was the look she wore when addressing officers who had failed in their duties so completely that their careers were effectively over. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice taking on the tone she used for formal military tribunals, "let me explain to you exactly what has transpired here today, because I don't think you fully comprehend the magnitude of your situation." Thompson stood there, his jaw clenched, still trying to maintain some semblance of authority even as everything crumbled around him. Sergeant Williams had moved to stand beside General Johnson, clearly aligning himself with her version of events rather than his subordinates. "You initiated a traffic stop with no probable cause," General Johnson continued, her words precise and devastating. "You searched my son's person and vehicle without consent or justification. You fabricated claims about marijuana odor and weapons that multiple witnesses can testify were false." She gestured toward the bystanders who were still recording everything, their phones capturing every word of this systematic dismantling of Thompson's defense. "You then physically assaulted a minor who was in full compliance with your instructions, using your knee to compress his back and airways in a manner that could have resulted in serious injury or death." Damon stood beside his mother, still shaken but drawing strength from her presence. The scrapes on his face were beginning to swell, and his shoulders ached from having his arms twisted behind his back, but he was safe now. He could see in his mother's bearing that she was in complete control of the situation. And when confronted by a superior authority, General Johnson pressed on. "Rather than acknowledging your errors and attempting to de-escalate the situation you had created, you chose to compound your mistakes by challenging my authority and refusing to accept responsibility for your actions." Officer Rodriguez had been taking notes throughout this exchange, documenting everything for his report. He knew that his career might depend on being on the right side of this incident, and it was crystal clear which side that was. "Officer Thompson," Sergeant Williams finally spoke up, "I need you to return to your vehicle and wait for internal affairs to arrive. You're being removed from this scene immediately." "This is bullshit," Thompson exploded, his professional composure finally shattering completely. "I've been a cop for 15 years. I know when someone is acting suspicious, and I know when I'm being threatened." "You felt threatened by a 17-year-old boy with a cell phone?" General Johnson's question was delivered with surgical precision. A teenager who was saying yes sir and no sir and asking politely if he could call his mother. Thompson's face was now bright red and the veins in his neck were standing out prominently. He knew he was trapped, knew that every word coming out of his mouth was making things worse for him, but he couldn't stop himself. "He was in the wrong neighborhood," Thompson shouted. "Kids like him don't just come to areas like this to shop for groceries. They come here to cause trouble, to sell drugs, to case houses for burglaries." The racist assumptions behind Thompson's words were now completely exposed for everyone to hear and record. The elderly woman who had been filming from across the street gasped audibly at the blatant bigotry being displayed. General Johnson let Thompson's words hang in the air for a moment, allowing them to be fully recorded and witnessed by everyone present. Then she responded with the devastating calm of someone who had just been handed a complete victory. "Officer Thompson, you have just provided clear evidence of the racial bias that motivated your illegal detention and assault of my son. Thank you for making the federal civil rights case against you so straightforward." She turned to Sergeant Williams. "I assume this conversation is being recorded by your body cameras?" "Yes, ma'am," Williams replied immediately. "Everything has been documented." General Johnson nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. I want copies of all recordings provided to federal authorities. I also want Officer Thompson's disciplinary record reviewed for patterns of similar behavior." Thompson was breathing heavily now, like a cornered animal who had finally realized there was no way out. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, he made one final desperate attempt to reassert control. "You think because you wear that uniform, you can come into my city and tell me how to do my job?" Thompson snarled at General Johnson. "This isn't the military. This is civilian law enforcement, and your rank doesn't mean anything here. The statement was so wrong, so tone-deaf and so professionally suicidal that even Rodriguez winced. Challenging the authority of a general officer while being investigated for civil rights violations was like pouring gasoline on a fire. General Johnson's response was measured and devastating. "Officer Thompson, you're absolutely correct that this isn't the military. In the military, officers who abuse their authority face swift and certain consequences. They don't get to hide behind qualified immunity or union protection. They face court-martial, imprisonment, and dishonorable discharge." She paused, letting that sink in. "You're also correct that my military rank doesn't give me authority over civilian police officers, but my status as a federal government official, my connections throughout the justice system, and my ability to ensure that this incident receives federal attention absolutely do give me the power to make sure you face appropriate consequences for your actions." General Johnson pulled out her phone again, this time making no attempt to hide what she was doing. "Agent Foster, this is General Patricia Johnson. I need to report a federal civil rights violation involving the assault of my minor son by a police officer. Yes, everything has been recorded. Multiple witnesses. Yes, I'll need a full federal investigation." As General Johnson spoke with what was clearly an FBI agent, Thompson's face went white. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his anger and denial. This wasn't going to be handled quietly by internal affairs. This wasn't going to disappear into the bureaucracy of the police department. This was going to be a federal case with national attention. "Officer Thompson," Sergeant Williams said quietly, "I strongly advise you to contact your union representative and an attorney. Now." Rodriguez had finished his preliminary notes and approached General Johnson respectfully. "Ma'am, I want to formally apologize for my failure to intervene more forcefully in this situation. Your son was clearly the victim of excessive force, and I should have done more to stop it." General Johnson studied the young officer for a moment before responding. "Officer Rodriguez, the fact that you recognize the wrongfulness of what occurred here suggests that you understand the difference between legitimate law enforcement and abuse of power. That's a start." She turned back to Thompson, who was now standing beside his patrol car, apparently on the phone with his union representative. "Officer Thompson," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the scene. "One more thing." Thompson looked up from his phone call. "My son is 17 years old. He's an honor student. He volunteers at a community center teaching basketball to younger children. He has never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law, never given anyone any reason to view him as a threat." General Johnson's voice carried a weight of maternal pain that was impossible to ignore. He was raised to respect authority, to comply with law enforcement, to be polite and cooperative even when he doesn't understand what's happening. I spent his entire childhood teaching him how to survive encounters with police officers. She gestured toward Damon, who was standing quietly beside her, still processing the trauma of what he had experienced. "Despite all of that preparation, despite his perfect compliance with your instructions, despite his respectful demeanor and cooperative attitude, you still felt justified in slamming his face into the asphalt and crushing him with your knee." General Johnson's voice grew stronger, more commanding. "That tells me that no amount of training, no level of compliance, no degree of respectfulness would have been enough to protect my son from your prejudice and aggression. And that, Officer Thompson, is why this incident cannot and will not be overlooked or forgotten." Thompson had stopped pretending to listen to his phone call and was staring at General Johnson with something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding about what he had actually done. "You didn't see a teenager shopping for his mother's dinner," General Johnson continued. "You saw a threat that needed to be neutralized. You didn't hear his polite responses and respectful tone. You heard defiance that needed to be crushed. You didn't recognize his compliance and cooperation. You saw resistance that needed to be overcome with violence." She paused, allowing her words to sink in not just with Thompson, but with all the officers present. "That is not law enforcement, Officer Thompson. That is the mentality of an occupying army in hostile territory. And it has no place in a free society." By now, additional vehicles had arrived at the scene. Internal affairs investigators, federal agents, and even a representative from the mayor's office who had been alerted to the situation through General Johnson's network of contacts. The quiet residential street had become a crime scene, with investigators documenting everything. 3 weeks after the incident, The first wave of consequences began to ripple through the police department and beyond. Officer Thompson had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but the writing was already on the wall. The body camera footage, witness testimonies, and the phone recording from General Johnson's device had created an airtight case of police brutality and civil rights violations. The video recordings from the incident had gone viral within hours of being uploaded to social media. The elderly woman who had filmed the encounter from her porch had titled her video, "Army General's Son Brutalized by Racist Cop. You Won't Believe What Happens Next." Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 2 million times and shared across every major social media platform. The footage was devastating to watch. It showed Damon's polite compliance throughout the traffic stop, Thompson's escalating aggression without cause, and the shocking moment when the officer slammed the teenager to the ground. But what made the video truly powerful was the moment when General Johnson arrived on the scene, transforming from grieving mother to commanding officer in a matter of seconds. News outlets across the country picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled, "When Military Authority Meets Police Brutality." Fox News covered it as General Protects Son from Rogue Cop. The Washington Post published an in-depth analysis of the incident under the headline, "How One Mother's Authority Changed Everything." But beyond the media coverage, real institutional change was beginning to take place. FBI agent Sarah Foster had taken personal charge of the federal investigation into Thompson's actions. Agent Foster was known for her meticulous approach to civil rights cases, and she had assembled a team of investigators who were treating this case with the seriousness it deserved. The federal investigation had uncovered a pattern of complaints against Thompson dating back nearly a decade. Internal affairs records showed multiple allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct. Most of these complaints had been dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline, but the federal investigators were reopening several cases to determine if there was a broader pattern of civil rights violations. "What we're seeing," Agent Foster explained to General Johnson during one of their meetings, "is a clear pattern of behavior that suggests Officer Thompson has been operating under the belief that he was above accountability. The incident with your son appears to be the culmination of years of increasingly aggressive and discriminatory policing." General Lear Johnson had become more than just a victim's mother in this case. She had become an advocate for systemic reform. Her military background and federal connections gave her access to decision-makers at every level of government, and she was using that access to push for meaningful changes to police training and accountability. The police department itself was in crisis mode. Chief Williams had been forced to hold multiple press conferences addressing the incident and the department's response to it. Internal Affairs had launched their own investigation, but everyone knew that the federal case would take precedence. "We are committed to full transparency and accountability in this matter," Chief Williams had told reporters. "Any officer who violates the civil rights of community members will face appropriate consequences, regardless of their years of service or previous record." Officer Rodriguez had become a key witness in the federal investigation. His testimony about Thompson's behavior during the incident, combined with his willingness to acknowledge his own failure to intervene more forcefully, had made him valuable to both the prosecution and the reform efforts within the department. "I've been thinking a lot about that day," Rodriguez told investigators during his formal interview. "I knew what Thompson was doing was wrong, but I was afraid to challenge a senior officer. I was more concerned about my career than I was about protecting an innocent kid from abuse." Rodriguez's honesty about his own failures had actually enhanced his credibility with investigators and reformers alike. His willingness to admit mistakes and learn from them stood in stark contrast to Thompson's continued denial and defiance. The community response to the incident had been overwhelming. The neighborhood where the traffic stop occurred had organized meetings to discuss police-community relations. Many residents expressed shock that such an incident could happen in their area, while others admitted that they had witnessed concerning behavior from officers before, but hadn't known how to report it. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had filmed the incident, had become an unlikely activist in her own right. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, she told a community meeting, "and I've never seen anything like what happened to that boy. But after watching the video again and again, I realized that I've seen officers treat young black men differently than they treat my grandson when he visits. The case had also attracted attention from civil rights organizations across the country. The NAACP had assigned a team of attorneys to monitor the federal prosecution. The ACLU was using the case as an example of why police reform was urgently needed. Black Lives Matter activists had organized peaceful protests demanding justice for Damon and accountability for Thompson. But perhaps most significantly, the incident had sparked conversations about police training and accountability within law enforcement itself. Police academies were beginning to use the video as a training tool, showing cadets exactly how not to conduct a traffic stop and how racial bias could lead to catastrophic outcomes. General Johnson had been invited to speak at several police academies, sharing her perspective as both a military officer and the mother of a brutality victim. Her presentations were powerful and well received, focusing on the importance of de-escalation, respect for civil rights, and the need for officers to police themselves. In the military, she would tell these audiences of future police officers, we understand that the power we are given comes with immense responsibility. We are trained to protect those who cannot protect themselves, not to see every interaction as a potential combat situation. She would often conclude these presentations by showing the audience a photo of Damon's scraped face taken immediately after the incident. This is what happens when an officer forgets that their job is to serve and protect, not to dominate and control. This is what happens when prejudice is allowed to masquerade as law enforcement. And this is why every one of you must commit to being better than Officer Thompson was on that day. The federal grand jury had been meeting regularly to consider charges against Thompson. Based on the evidence presented, most legal experts expected multiple federal charges including deprivation of rights under color of law, excessive force, and potentially hate crime enhancements due to the racial nature of the targeting. Thompson's attorney had been pushing for a plea deal, recognizing that the evidence against his client was overwhelming, but federal prosecutors, under pressure from both the community and high-ranking officials like General Johnson, were insisting on significant jail time and a guilty plea to felony charges that would bar Thompson from ever working in law enforcement again. We're not interested in slap-on-the-wrist justice, Agent Foster told the media. The evidence shows a clear pattern of civil rights violations, and we intend to pursue charges that reflect the severity of those violations. The civil lawsuit filed by General Johnson's attorneys was proceeding on a parallel track. The department's insurance company had already indicated a willingness to settle for a significant sum, but General Johnson had made it clear that money wasn't her primary concern. I want systemic changes, she told her legal team. I want training reforms, accountability measures, and guarantees that no other parent will have to watch their child be brutalized the way mine was. The lawsuit was seeking not just monetary damages, but court-ordered reforms to police training, supervision, and disciplinary procedures. If successful, it could serve as a model for similar reforms in police departments across the country. Damon himself was still processing the trauma of what he had experienced. He had begun seeing a counselor who specialized in helping victims of police violence, and he was slowly working through his fear and anger about the incident. I keep wondering what would have happened if my mom hadn't shown up, he told his counselor during one session. Would I have ended up like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or so many others? The counselor helped him understand that survivors' guilt was common among victims of police violence, especially when the outcome was better than it could have been. But she also helped him see that his experience, while traumatic, could serve a purpose in preventing similar incidents from happening to other young people. Your story is powerful because you survived to tell it, she explained, and your mother's presence and authority changed the narrative in a way that's helping other people understand what police reform really means. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the incident was having impacts far beyond the immediate participants. Police departments in other cities were reviewing their own training and accountability procedures. Federal lawmakers were citing the case in debates about police reform legislation, and community activists were using the video as an example of both the problem of police brutality and the power of organized response to it. 6 months after that life-changing afternoon, the wheels of justice had turned with unusual speed and decisiveness. Officer Derek Thompson sat in federal court, no longer wearing the uniform that had given him authority for 15 years. Instead, He wore an ill-fitting suit and the expression of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his actions, but only after it was far too late. The federal charges against Thompson had been extensive: deprivation of rights under color of law, excessive force filing false reports, and civil rights violations with hate crime enhancements. The evidence had been so overwhelming that his attorney had eventually convinced him to accept a plea deal, rather than face the possibility of decades in prison. Thompson was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He was permanently barred from working in law enforcement and required to pay restitution to Damon for medical expenses and counseling costs. But perhaps most significantly, he was required to participate in a victim impact program, where he would have to face the consequences of his actions in a structured setting. "Mr. Thompson," the federal judge had said during sentencing, "you took an oath to serve and protect the members of your community. Instead, you terrorized a 17-year-old boy whose only crime was shopping for groceries while black. Your actions have brought shame not only upon yourself, but upon every honest police officer who tries to do their job with integrity and respect for civil rights." The judge's words had been broadcast live, and they resonated far beyond the courtroom. Officer Rodriguez had faced a different kind of reckoning. While he wasn't charged with any crimes, he had been suspended for 2 weeks without pay for failing to intervene in Thompson's assault on Damon. But more importantly, the incident had changed him fundamentally as a police officer and as a person. Rodriguez had requested a transfer to the Internal Affairs Division, where he could investigate misconduct by other officers. He had also become a vocal advocate within the department for bystander intervention training, programs that would require officers to stop their colleagues when they witnessed excessive force or other misconduct. "I failed that kid," Rodriguez told a police training conference 6 months later. "I knew what Thompson was doing was wrong, but I was more worried about my partnership with a senior officer than I was about protecting an innocent teenager from abuse. That's a failure I have to live with for the rest of my career." Rodriguez's presentation to new recruits had become part of the standard training curriculum at police academies throughout the state. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them had made him a powerful voice for reform within law enforcement. General Johnson had channeled her experience into a broader mission of police reform and community relations. She had taken a leave of absence from her Pentagon duties to focus on advocacy work, speaking at conferences, consulting with police departments, and working with lawmakers on reform legislation. Her approach was uniquely effective because she came from a military background that most police officers respected. She could speak their language while also holding them accountable to higher standards. In the military, we call it failure of leadership, when subordinates are allowed to abuse their authority, she would tell police audiences. "We understand that the chain of command has a responsibility to prevent misconduct, not just punish it after the fact." Her advocacy had contributed to the passage of federal legislation requiring police departments to implement bystander intervention training, establish civilian oversight boards, and maintain public databases of officer misconduct records. The police department where Thompson had worked had undergone significant reforms. A new police chief had been hired, bringing with her a commitment to community policing and zero tolerance for misconduct. The department had implemented new training programs, revised its disciplinary procedures, and established a civilian review board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend consequences. Body cameras had been made mandatory for all officers, with strict penalties for officers who forgot to activate them or whose cameras mysteriously malfunctioned during critical incidents. The department had also partnered with community organizations to provide cultural sensitivity training and